Hi, kindergarten. Mrs. Wheaton here. I'm excited today to read you a story called Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown, pictures by Scott Nash. In this story, we meet a character, Flat Stanley, who becomes flat and he goes on some adventures. This story is a fictional story, so there's lots of silly and make-believe things that happen, so I don't want you to worry. There's a problem in the story because he decides he doesn't want to be flat anymore and he wants to be round and back to being a human boy. Let's see how they solve the problem. One of the things I want you to notice is how kind and caring Stanley is and how helpful he is. You might hear some bucket dipping in the story, and that's the way the writer wants to remind us that it doesn't matter what we look like, what color our hair is, what clothes we wear. What really matters is that we are all different, and that's what makes each of us special. I'm excited to share this story with you today because it has given the kindergarten team an idea. I hope you enjoy this story. Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown, pictures by Scott Nash. Hey, come and look, Arthur Lambchop called from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop cared greatly for politeness and correct speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, said Mrs. Lambchop. But look, said Arthur, pointing. He looks quite surprised and worried. I wonder what happened. Across Stanley's bed lay his enormous bulletin board. It had fallen on Stanley during the night. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed, but Stanley wasn't hurt. What's going on here? He said cheerfully, sitting up. Heavens, cried Mrs. Lambchop. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Lambchop. Darnest thing I've ever seen. Mrs. Lambchop sighed and said, Let's all have breakfast, then we'll hear what Dr. Dan has to say. I'm not sure we should worry about things falling or becoming flat. This is definitely a silly made-up thing from our story today. So please don't worry. In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley. How do you feel? He asked. I felt sort of tickly after I got up, Stanley said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. The nurses took Stanley's measurements. He was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and half an inch thick. He looks flat as a pancake to me, like you could fold him up and being flat could be fun. Stanley enjoyed going in and out of rooms by sliding through the crack at the bottom of the door. Arthur tried too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could be exciting. During the holidays, Stanley was invited to visit his friend Thomas in California. Mr. Lambchop brought home an enormous brown paper envelope and said, Stanley, try this on for size. The envelope fitted Stanley very well, and the next morning his parents slid him into it, along with an egg salad sandwich, and posted him from the box on the corner. Awfully silly that they're going to in fact mail Stanley all the way to California. He looks quite happy. Stanley had a fine time in California. Thomas's family returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. They marked it airmail and wrote valuable, and this end up on both sides. Quite silly. In the park one Sunday afternoon, Stanley and Arthur watched some boys flying big kites. Someday, Arthur said, I would like to have a big kite. You can fly me, Arthur, Stanley said. Come on. He gave Arthur the spool and attached the string to his arms. Then he ran across the grass to catch the wind. Up, up, up went Stanley. Arthur let out all of the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees. Everyone stood still to watch. That was awfully kind of Stanley to let Arthur fly the kite that he's always wanted to fly. But Arthur got tired of running with the empty spool. Wedging it in the fork of a tree, he went off for a hot dog. He didn't notice when Stanley became tangled in the branches of the tree. Half an hour passed before Arthur heard Stanley's shouts and climbed up to set him free. Arthur apologized over and over again that evening, but Stanley was still cross. Cross means upset or angry, mad, and I think you can see that by looking at Stanley's face that he definitely is not happy with his brother Arthur. I'm not sure I would be happy either. The next morning, Stanley and Mr. Lambchop met their neighbor, Mr. O.J. Dart, director of the famous Museum of Art. Mr. Dart looked worried. Another valuable painting was stolen from the famous museum last night, he told Stanley and his father. The police suspect a gang of sneak thieves. They work at night by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. Stanley had an idea. He explained it to Mr. Dart. Excellent, said Mr. Dart. We'll try out your plan tonight. I wonder what's going to happen next. That evening, in the main hall of the museum, Mr. Dart showed Stanley the most expensive painting in the world. Next to it was an empty picture frame. And now, Stanley said, Mr. Dart, it's time for your disguise. Stanley showed Mr. Dart the disguise he had brought. This is a really good one, my cowboy hat and red bandana. I'm sorry, Mr. Dart said, but we don't have cowboy pictures here. You must wear the disguise I have chosen. Stanley could hardly speak when he saw Mr. Dart's disguise. I look like a girl, he said, but Stanley was a good sport, so he put it on. Can you guess what Stanley's disguise is? Think about it. Bo Peep. In the main hall, Stanley climbed into the empty picture frame and stood very still. Very nice, said Mr. Dart, and went off to arrange the rest of their plan. Now Stanley was alone. The hall was very dark, but enough moonlight came through the windows for him to see the world's most expensive painting. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come, he thought. Then, creak! A glow of yellow light shone suddenly in the center of the hall. A trap door had opened in the floor. The sneak thieves carrying lanterns came up into the hall. Look at Stanley's face. Wonder if he's feeling worried, or scared even. Awfully brave of him. The thieves took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. This is it, Max, said the first thief, whose name was Luther. In all this great city there is no one to suspect us. Then Luther saw Stanley in his frame. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max, he said. This one looks scared. Stanley managed a tiny smile. She is smiling, sort of, Max said. And what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. In his loudest voice he shouted, Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here! I bet that was unexpected for the sneak thieves. Talking picture frame. Quite clever, Stanley. Max, Luther whispered, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest. Max whispered back, You'll get a rest all right, shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with lots of policemen. You'll get arrested, that's what. The sneak thieves were quickly handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop got a medal from the chief of police. The day after that, his picture was all in the newspapers. For a while, Stanley was famous. People would point him out and whisper, "Over there, Agnes, Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the museum robbers," and things like that. But then people began to make fun of him. "Hi, Super Skinny," they would call. And we know that's not very nice. And that's dipping into Stanley and everyone else's bucket. Poor Stanley. Late one night, Arthur woke to the sound of Stanley crying. "What's wrong?" he said. Stanley sighed. "I want to be a regular shape again like other people. It's not fair." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." And then Arthur had an idea. He turned on the light and ran to the big toy box in the corner. He tossed aside toy soldiers, airplanes, and boat models. "Got it," he said, holding up an old bicycle pump. I wonder what Arthur is thinking. He has a plan. I really like how he complimented Stanley, too, by telling him he's brave. That filled my bucket. "Okay," Stanley said after a moment, "but take it easy." He stood with the end of the hose in his mouth, clamping his lips tightly so no air could escape. Arthur began to pump. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand," he said. Stanley's top half began to swell. Stanley got bigger and bigger. His pajama buttons burst off. Pop, pop, pop. My goodness. Soon he was all rounded out except for his right foot. He shook the foot twice and it swelled to match the other one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop came in to see what the boys were up to so late at night. "George," said Mrs. Lambchop, "Stanley's round again." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the brothers back into bed and turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. Very soon, the Lambchops were asleep. So I really enjoyed reading with you today. I know at the beginning of the story we talked a little bit about how some of the parts of the story have parts that are filling our bucket and maybe also even dipping into our bucket a little bit. So at this time, this might be a good time for you to turn and talk to one of your grown-ups about what was both bucket dip filling in the story and also some of the parts that might have been a little bit bucket dipping. And I want you to remember, while thinking about this, that it doesn't matter what you look like, what you wear. What matters is the way you treat others. So now I want you to think about the part of the story in the very, very beginning when Flat Stanley goes on an adventure. Can you tell somebody where Flat Stanley went? Do you remember what he did when he went to that special place and how he got there? I want you to be thinking about it because it gave the kindergarten team an idea. I miss you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful day. Remember to be kind. Love you.